Hello everybody, welcome to our event today looking at queering creative health. We're going to be looking at the intersections of LGBT communities and the creative health movement. And so I thought I'd start today just talking you through what creative health is through a few slides. Will we be able to get them onto the screen, please? Thank you. So creative health then is any kind of activity or approach that is creative that has benefits to our health and well-being. That can be really broad for some people to understand. So I thought I'd give some examples of that. So if we look at activities, this is things like singing for lung health is a great example of physical health activity. In mental health, we have things like creative art therapies. In mental well-being, a great example is anti-loneliness, craft cafes. We have things like museum exhibitions on disability that are great at promoting health. And then we have research methods like Lego Serious Play. We also have approaches that are deemed to be creative health. Examples of this are things like using local community assets as maintaining capacity in healthcare. One that I'm really particularly passionate about is using community arts providers to support the 6,000 person deficit in clinical mental health support. So this is using arts groups in our community, for example, as a way of accessing mental health support instead of being trapped in waiting lists. We also have things like communicating in non-verbal or non-literal ways of knowing. This is great, for example, within dementia care, where there is a different way of conceptualizing the world, being able to talk to people on their own terms. We also have things like working equitably with service users or participants to co-design health solutions. These often involve creative activities as power leveling facilitators, but the act of bringing in people with lived experience is deemed a creative health approach in itself for our organisation, NCCH. Creative responses to health psychology can be things like decorating the stairs to reduce the reliance on lifts and escalators, or putting arts in hospital to increase the recovery time and reduce pain. A cultural change in healthcare is my final example for today. And this is things such as using creative wellbeing activities with staff as a catalyst for more creative, person-centered responses to patient care. So this is quite a broad range of things. We're going to be looking at the specifics of how this relates to LGBT communities. If you have any questions today that you would like to follow up, I work for the National Centre of Creative Health, and I'm always happy to have conversations with anyone that is interested in this area. And now that we've had that little introduction, I'd love to introduce our two speakers today, which is Francis and Yasmin. Hello, both of you. Would you like to do a quick introduction of who you are and what your background is, starting with Francis?
Hey, hello everybody. Yes, my name is Frances Williams and my pronouns are she, her. I have a background in Gallery education mainly. As you can see, I'm a bit old, so I've done a lot of things over the years, but most recently a PhD. So in between practice and academia, a bit of theory and practice both.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Yasmin, pronouns she, they, and my background work experience has been doing a lot of community research with different organizations and communities, and including Queer Circle, which is why I'm here today to talk about the work that we did together.
Yeah, I forgot to mention Queer Circle, sorry. So I am the health and research lead for a new LGBTQ organisation in London called Queer Circle, which has been open, well, it'll be 2 years in June. So we're new.
Fantastic. And I first came across both of you guys via your Queering Creative Health report and scene, which I'm hoping we can hear more about later. But for now, it would be great to have your presentations. Who are we going first? Perfect.
There you go. So yeah, we've titled this Living Histories, Situating Creative Health in Relation to LGBTQ plus communities. partly because it's LGBTQ History Month this month, so that's our peg for the talk, but also to think about how longer stories of creative health, histories of creative health, feed into the kind of definitions of creative health that Jane has kindly just tried to encapsulate in her 2-minute definition there. So in a way, as well as the short story of creative health, looking back to the longer history. So my preamble will do a little bit of that, and then we'll jump into the reports which were published only last year that Yasmin authored, and she can talk to you about how she went about producing those. And really they capture what many people in LGBTQ communities think about creative health today. Are they even aware of it? Is it a thing? In what way does it intersect? Doesn't it? How does that all work? How do people think about creativity and health? Do they put them together? That's the area of research that Yasmin was concerned with the reports. So just to give a bit of historic background to this relationship, let's have the next slide, please, Faye. So I actually wrote a book on when was arts in health, just to mention that creative health is the latest iteration of a sort of series of names that these sets of practices have come under over the years. Partly when I worked within it, I was concerned to think, well, when did it start? Where is it going and where will it end? So the impetus for writing the history was a literature review of arts and health, where it proved really difficult to pin down. And I sort of, rather than avoiding the difficulty and messiness, decided to jump right into it and explore what that mess was. What was creative health before creativity and health were put together? At what point were they conjoined, by whom and in what kind of context? So that's the book that came out after doing my PhD, which was done through Manchester Metropolitan University in not so far from Leicester, up the road there, I guess. And they've been long considered to be a centre for creative health. When it was called Arts in Health, there was a big move to set up a research centre for the first time at Manchester. Probably Manchester and Durham are the first universities that began with this journey. And I know Leicester, I'm wondering now, health and medicine, I think, is the course that some of you belong to, but I gather that you're drawn from all over, or just LGBTQ. Welcome. The other little picture here is a zine of people making together. So as well as doing sort of, as I mentioned before, academic writing, it's not that academic, I hope, the book. I hope it's very accessible, but I'm also a practitioner, so I spent a long time in gallery education, which is where a lot of creative health work perhaps sits. In terms of communities, art galleries are outposts for art and often host a lot of provide the settings, I guess, for what creative health is. So I spend a lot of my time, in fact, all this junk behind me, we've got art materials where people do a lot of this stuff. So we've got a big long table here full of stuff where people sit around and do just that. Yeah, a little quick tour of where I am. Next slide, please. I think it's just really important to mention that the relationship has been quite difficult, really, between LGBTQ communities and the medical authority, especially given that we were pathologized by the medical establishment, and particularly in terms of psychiatry. So this is a wonderful little magazine. You can find it online, the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto from 1971, where there's a lovely resume of all the demands that were made at this point in time by activists demanding LGBTQ rights. And it includes, amongst other things, that psychiatrists stop treating homosexuality as though it were a sickness, thereby giving gay people senseless guilt complexes. It's quite a good range of demands they've got here. There's also something about sex education in schools, which feels kind of relevant today in relation to young trans people. There's also something there for the age of consent. Yeah, an amazing document that I would encourage you to all read. But basically, it's not a happy relationship with the medical establishment at that point. Yeah, next slide, please. So that was produced, that little manifesto, in the 1970s. In the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic arrived, and perhaps more than any other epoch, if you like, any other decade, that's kind of the main association between LGBTQ communities and mobilizations around illness and disease happened during this time. And there were very, very many artists that were part of that movement, almost like a DIY public health movement, to use the arts as a power for social change in that particular context. Keith Haring is perhaps the most well known, but many others in the UK, filmmakers like Derek Jarman, for example, were very much part of social movements at this time. And there's much talk of creative health as a social movement, but it kind of nests itself and sits within the distinctive social movements as well. Also the Black Power movement, so the Black Panthers set up alternative health centres, both in America and in the UK during the 70s as well. So interesting rejections of state health systems to address specific communities' needs with specific issues and illnesses and discriminations. So there's always been this kind of liberatory aspect to the work that's latent within these activities, I would argue. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar with the AIDS Project and the quilt that was produced with panels of the names of people who died in the AIDS epidemic. It's one of the earliest sort of visualizations of mass death, prior to our current COVID-19 world pandemic. In this epidemic, there was a sort of presentation visually of the effect and the loss and the impact of that through this community artwork that was displayed in front of the White House and then toured across the world. And interestingly, it formed one of the chapters of this book, which was one of the first books to carve out a space for arts in health, which was produced in about, published around 1999. And that's when the first national mobilisation for arts in health occurred, and the first institutions that were bespoke arts in health were set up in the millennium. So really, you could say that the current creative health movement stems from this point at the turn of the millennium. So it's around 20 to 30 years old, you could say. I would argue. This is an interesting book to read. You can find it on the King's Fund website if you want to flip through and have a read about how they conceived of the quilt as an example of creative health. You can read about it there. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the latest definitive document, if you like, that named creative or renamed creative health in 2017. It's an advocacy report aimed at government around certain policy changes, but it includes a really broad set of arguments based on the social determinants of health, but also a lot of examples of this work as well. And I guess it's been very influential in setting up both the National Centre for Creative Health and the Creative Health and Wellbeing Alliance, which is more the membership body. So lots has come out of the recommendations of this report, which was published in 2017, right in the middle of my PhD. So something which, I've studied a lot. Interestingly, there's no mention of LGBTQ communities within this at all. There's a more generalised short paragraph around marginalised communities that talks about race, gender and sexuality. But there isn't really any specific project that links queerness or LGBTQ communities to creative health practice in the report. Next slide, please. So here's the report that we produced here last year. Yasmin will give you the background of how it was commissioned, but there was a pre-existing relationship between the founder of Queer Circle and University College London, and we were able to work with the engagement team to commission a piece of work that asked, how do people in our community understand this term, and what shall we do with this, really? I guess I had an investment in the area and wanted to know, so I brought my knowledge into the field. And then subsequent to that, we also commissioned a cartoonist and thinker as well. Produced lots of books called M.J. Barker to produce the zine, which is itself similar but different in terms of unpacking a lot of the ideas around how queering creative health might be useful. So at this point, I'm hoping 15 minutes there. Yasmin, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Francis. And can we have the next slide, please? So yeah, to follow on from what Francis had said, I was brought on board to coordinate and carry out this evaluation a couple of months after Queer Circle had first opened in the summer of 2022. And so this kind of took place between then up until winter, beginning of 2023. And what I will say about the research is that in terms of our approach, we spend a lot of time at the very beginning to think about what we're doing and to take an almost exploratory approach. And so I think a lot of creative health work now relies on charity and community organizations as delivery partners, or sometimes they're the ones who are spearheading these projects. And you're always sort of restricted by funding requirements and reporting deadlines and things like that. And there's a sense of urgency. But as Francis has discussed, we wanted to recognize that the relationship between LGBTQ plus people and health and well-being has a specific social and historical context. And we really need to understand that for any health or well-being intervention to make sense, whether that's a creative one or not. And so that's why in approaching this project, we decided that we would work with Queer Circle stakeholders. So that's facilitators, artists, participants, and anyone who engages with their work to actually ask them, what does health and well-being mean to them, so that the outcomes of our research are relevant to their experiences and really resonate with them. So with that in mind, I'll speak first a little bit about what people have told us about what they think about health and well-being before sharing a couple of findings from the report. Next slide, please. So when we ask people what health and well-being means to them, this is what they told us. So the first thing is this idea of relationality. People told us that it's about more than individual bodies and minds. You know, it's about being in a space together, being around others who are affirmative and can offer support, or come from a similar place where they understand you. And there's also another side of that relationality, and that's about our relationship within and to the institutions that are meant to keep us well, whether that's, healthcare, education, or even the judicial system, and how they can do that in a way that doesn't essentialize or homogenize LGBTQ identity. And the second side of that is around this idea of care, the provision of safety. And a lot of people that we spoke to talked about vulnerability a lot. Someone said that to exist honestly as a queer person, you have to be vulnerable because you are made vulnerable by existing. And, unpacking that a little bit, one way that care has been thought about is that, when you care for someone, you respond to their vulnerabilities, where they're hurt or injured and need attention, and you show up for them. But really, there's a second side to that as well, which is that when you care, you want to act against those things that have caused those injuries in the first place. And so when people spoke about queer health and well-being, they, of course, talked about taking care of each other and nurturing each other. But at the same time, the conversation always went back to the structural injustices that affect our lives. So the failings of the healthcare system and even the destruction of the planet. People are always conscious of the reason that that care is needed in the first place. And so there's a recognition that both of these dimensions of care are linked, and that it's not enough to do just one, you have to do both. And finally, the third dimension is the idea that health and well-being is not a linear process. So here I've put in a quote from one of the participants who said that well-being doesn't look like going from sad to happy, it's more complicated than that. And so in other words, it's not about necessarily restoring the body or the mind to some normative or standard way to be, and we all know the risks that come with ideas of normativity. And so for the participants, what was important was actually engaging in the process itself. For example, confronting difficult emotions in a safe and well-facilitated space to process their thoughts. And it doesn't mean that you always leave the space feeling happier, but having that space to think about and process what was troubling you, that's, I think, one of the real potentials of arts-based practices. Next slide, please. And so bringing all of these concepts together, we came up with what I like to call a queer configuration of health. And so this is really to try to make visible how the way that we understand or define a concept like health ends up shaping the solutions we find. And this has obvious resonances with how we understand the value of creative practices within the field of creative health. So for example, if our idea of ill health is when an individual body is contaminated or damaged in some way, then we might turn to medicine or other interventions, including creative practices, to cure us or to repair us of those damages. But if instead we understand ill health to be bound up with others and the world around us in that relational sense that I was talking about, then our work becomes the work of making sure that everyone can live more livable lives, whether that's human or non-human. And so, putting this here, we're not saying that these are somehow two real models of health, and queering the idea of health doesn't deny the usefulness of biomedicine, but this is more of a provocation, if you like, of to help us think about what possibilities lie outside of biomedical approaches and whether biomedical approaches always construct the right solutions to make us feel better. Next slide, please. So having gone through that framework and with those things in mind, I won't go into all the details about what we found out through the evaluation, but I will pull out some of the key ideas that we found. So thinking with these ideas of queer health, of relationality and care, one of the things that we found important was around the permeability of queer circle space. So to give a little bit of context, especially in that first year of programming, there was a very kind of permeable approach in terms of people bringing their ideas of what they wanted to do with the space, and Queer Circle also led on delivering and programming some activities. But regardless, Queer Circle did act as this physical and stable venue, which is increasingly rare for the queer community. But on the other hand, it didn't function as a fixed or idealized institution in the way that a traditional gallery or museum might do. And in that sense, it doesn't prescribe a correct way of using the space, which leaves visitors to engage with it on their own terms. And so that in itself was found to be really valuable, to have the space to be in and around others who share an understanding with little obligation. And the other thread was this notion of empowerment, but not in an individual sense, more as a collective one. So in that report that, in the Creative Health Report, the really big one that came out in 2017, there are mentions of empowerment, but in the sense of claiming mastery sort of over your individual health and well-being. But some of what we discussed was how that doesn't necessarily resonate with the queer community when there has been such a long history of people having to take care and to take mastery over health and well-being because of the failings of the healthcare system. But on the other hand, we pulled out a case study of a 4-week workshop which Queer Circle delivered in partnership with a local sixth form college, where an artist worked with students to develop artistic responses to local political issues. And one of these was around the Silvertown Tunnel, which is a tunnel that's being built under the Thames that's going to exacerbate air pollution in these East London boroughs where the students live and study. And so when we spoke to students about what they found important in these workshops that they took part in, they did talk about traditional creative health issues such as mental well-being, feeling less anxious or more confident. But interestingly, another big thread of what they talked about was around political consciousness raising. So students said that they felt more confident to speak up about local issues, having engaged in political issues in this way. And the others spoke about feeling feeling more confident to use art to raise awareness of other social issues in the future. And so I think this is a really good example of how art making can take us beyond ideas of empowerment as individual control, but towards a more collective pursuit to bring others in on our political missions for healthier, more livable lives. Next slide, please. So yeah, that was a quick whiz through of just some of what we covered in the report. And if you're interested, do take a look online. And here I've put in a link, and I'm sure the links will be shared later. But I also want to shout out to the zine, which covers similar themes, but in a different way. And it's really wonderful, and you don't have to wade through loads of text. So do take a look at that in particular. But you know, I think a key reflection, having led on this research project, and what I hope people take away, is that creative and artistic practices obviously do have real and tangible impacts on our health and well-being, but we always have to understand these in a context-specific way. Who are the people engaging in these? Where is it taking place? And how is it being facilitated? And so in particular, here I pull out a page from MJ's zine, where they took a very expansive approach towards exploring all of these terms, including health and well-being and creativity, to really think about all the ways that they could be understood in the ways that they mean. And so in unpacking these, I think it's a good reminder for us that we shouldn't take any of these terms for granted, especially in creative health work, and especially what health means and feels like. And it's only by embracing that complexity and nuance that we can make creative health do what we want it to do. So I'll kind of leave that here, and I'll pass it back to Frances, because I think she had one more slide to wrap up.
Oh, did we? Yeah, there is one more slide. Thanks, Yasmin. So yeah, in this year there was a creative health review, and queering creative health got a mention, which is in itself a kind of specific mention, right, in the way that you suggest, Yasmin. So it has become part of the creative health vocabulary and discussion, we hope. And one of the reasons we're here to have a talk with you all today is to throw that back out and say, is this part of this for you, and how? I think that's it, right, Yasmin?
That's it, and yeah.
That's it.
Thank you both so much. Really, really interesting conversation. And I think what really resonates for me is, obviously I do work at the National Centre for Creative Health. I'm in that kind of system side of it, where we're trying to talk on their terms, but then on the same time I'm queer myself, and I'm going, well, these aren't always my terms. So like finding that negotiation was something that I'm definitely passionate about learning more about and understanding how to embed in my work. And yeah, I guess my first question to you, before I ask the question, I'll just say, for anyone that may have any questions, if you put them in the comments, I will be sure to make sure they're included as well. Yeah, to start us off, how do you negotiate how that kind of communication happens between systems and between queer communities, and where the power lies in how that definition of creative health gets actualized?
Yeah, we tried to have our cake and eat it, I'm afraid. So as well as being really open, so there was one person I'm thinking of in particular, an artist who did a lot of work on grief and bereavement in the trans community, that did some workshops with us, for whom the term creative health didn't have any meaning at all until we had that discussion. And it made me think, did it need to happen at all if they were already doing the work, you know? So it's interesting to think like that, and really to go deeper then to ask, well, what are these practices, and how are you working in this way with these communities and these feelings, and what, as Yasmin pointed out, what's led you led you to have to do this work in the first place, right? So on the one hand, we're open to that. And then on the other hand, we're really aware of the policy issues within London. So I guess the GLA is broadly supportive of LGBTQ rights. And, currently we have an artist working downstairs on a fourth plinth commission that's working directly with the community as well. So it's messy. Like, we work across all different levels and try to open up both ways. Like, it's not like we're tapping on one door and shutting another. I think we're genuinely trying to open doors both ways so that, the artist I mentioned could gain an understanding of creative health, what it was worth, and decide whether that was important for them. And at the same time, introduce the idea of creating health to the policymakers in London. And interestingly, they were like, oh, well, that definition of health is probably like already like creative health anyway, so that's not new. And we're going to put you in the section in the report about diversity in the workforce. So you get located in spaces there too. So yeah. So there's doors different directions, and that might lead to some contradictions, but it's a space in galleries that galleries like ours often occupy, I guess.
Yeah.
And I also think, like I was speaking a little bit about in my presentation, I mean, to take a slightly different approach to answering this question, is that it was quite a unique project in that there were not very many restrictions on where the research / evaluation would go. We had a lot of freedom to kind of decide the scope of the research. And I think that's like a luxury that you don't always get if you're working in community settings, if you have like funding obligations. And I think that also that, interesting overlap of research versus evaluation, I think there's a risk of, taking like a heavy-handed evaluation approach. That means that you are just measuring the things that have been measured and not really thinking about what it is that you actually want to measure. And so how to build in the time to define that, and especially if you're thinking about more like co-produced or community-led ways of thinking about how to embed what the people who are actually taking part want out of that process. I think, it's a tricky one to negotiate. There are others.
I guess. Go on.
No, go on.
I was going to say, picking up on that a bit then, when you were thinking about how to design this project, and was it quite an iterative approach in understanding what to evaluate or like what to explore? Like how did you balance out that power relation in a room when you're thinking about co-production?
I mean, actually, I said the word co-production, but I hesitated because Frances and I like to call this a more community-led approach, because we are aware of, all the ways that co-production gets used and like what is like a true or a good use of this term and what isn't. And so we wanted to, knowing that we didn't really take exactly like the most co-productive co-production you could do, we called it community-led, because we and so I think as the part of doing that is that process of speaking to the people who were involved with Queer Circle, and some of them continue to be. And then I think another thing are those kind of Korean creative health like events that Queer Circle hosted, where we brought in a lot of people who were involved, people who would like to be involved, and then to have that open platform for people to share what was important to them, and to take all of that into consideration. But also going back a little bit, I think what really helped me at the beginning, and as this project was situated between UCL and the public engagement team and Queer Circle, I was literally just like spending days like reading and thinking and like talking to people, and not feeling like I had to get into it straight away and had to carry out this many interviews by this point. And I think that once again it's like the luxury of time that helped with that. I don't know if you had more to add, Frances.
Yeah, I was just going to say how generative that approach was, and how you were really, because once you made your tentative findings with interviews with specific people, you wanted to bring it into a more group situation. And that was the first time, usually as a commissioner I'd work with individuals and they do their own thing, but to actually bring everybody together you could feel the energy in the room, where you could see common threads, you could see themes, or people would start talking to each other about this and that and working together. And suddenly there was this new energy in the room, which was part of your project to capture, Yasmin, in terms of like seeing how it landed, all this, your at that point, what you call them, hypotheses. But like actually we've run with that. So that is now something called the Queer and Creative Health Network that meets 3 times a year. And that is in the process of having its own research arm that is more community leaning. So as you are, Jane, you know, you've got 2 hats, if you like. You're in this system, but you've also got, you know, your own perspective on things. So it's giving academics that are queer space to explore and to develop their own community, working alongside participants within our programme to develop the strands of research that are based on what we need to know. As much as we can start to develop that, rather than academics coming in from flying in from university saying, we need to know how this works for creative health, you know?
Yeah.
Also jumping in on that, like, because Francis, like, you raised a good point, because when we were doing this project, this was always kind of like a pilot evaluation, or it was like the beginning of something. And it seems very final to have a report and a zine and to have it on the website that like, it's like, okay, this is it. This is creative health. But I think like what is important is the things that are being picked up. And that's kind of like the afterlife of like this project, but like it is also a continuation of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting afterlife, because just the term queer and creative health has now travelled, you know, including to the initial slide to a university like yours. So in itself, that's like, ooh, it's like a thing now. It's got its own life, you know, that's like a scary thing. But actually, I think it was probably a bit schizophrenic. Can you use that word in this context? I don't know. There's like a really linear, dense academic report, engaging, but like you had to concentrate for quite a long time to read through it. And then there was this zine that was like quirky and you could dip in and out and it would go. So like in a way we're trying to synthesize that. So probably the future research that we'll put out will be much more integrated across those kind of languages, if you like. And actually the word research is in itself problematic for me. So it'd be more like talking about community knowledge. So latent knowledges, embodied knowledges, non-verbal knowledges, histories, those are the kind of places that, you know, explicit research maybe is not the right word to describe, because it's already there, but maybe unarticulated or resting in peculiar places through often key people going back years that retain that knowledge, you know.
When you were kind of working with the communities, what were some of those ways that they felt disenfranchised from the kind of existing systems? What kind of conversations came up with that? Because I kind of have my own instinctual ideas of that, but I'd love to hear what came up from that big group.
Yasmin, would you like to?
I'm actually just trying to jog my mind back, because it has been, I think like a lot of what came up probably are like the usual suspects to to kind of pick up on your what you're saying. But because I'm not sure if you meant like the kind of days when we had like the Korean Creative Health Network events, or like in the individual conversations that we had, but I'm like right now thinking about like the individual conversations with people, and I think that people are dissatisfied with a lot of things. But I think what's interesting is for them how all of those different things are connected. So I think that's also why like I put a lot of emphasis on the relationality aspect, because it's really hard to isolate like one issue from another when it's like the wider policy landscape, and then to zoom out even further than that, like the anxiety of climate change, and that's also especially because Queer Circle works with the Greenwich Ecology Centre, and so there were these really lovely outdoor sessions, but then how do you make sense of that, and how does that process make you feel well if you're engaging in that, but actually what you're talking about is like these very existential threats? So yeah, that's kind of my reflection.
Yeah, I think school structures certainly came up, identified by the students, and continues to be as difficult to work within, for sure. Even the frame of the university itself wasn't easy. It was quite problematic in terms of UCL, in terms of what happened to the engagement team. Was disbanded shortly afterwards, and their policy on trans inclusion changed during this time as well. So it was all around. It felt like a bit all around sometimes. I guess there were particular pressures on particular communities within the LGBTQ emphasis as well. I would argue that, I don't know if it came up directly within your research, Yasmin, or Jane, what you had in mind with your usual suspects in that respect, or could you name?
Well, I guess, so one of the resources that we'll be sharing at the end is a blog that I created about personalised care, which is the NHS in their future plan said that we were going to be able to, as members of the community, have choice over what our responses were to our health needs. So we could choose creative health provisions, technically, if this was implemented how it was written out. So I was looking there at like, if instead of putting somebody with a therapist that has no idea about LGBT identities and how that might sit with somebody, and therefore isn't using the right kind of language to make somebody feel seen and heard, like what happens if you put them in a group in the kind of way that you were saying, where there's resonance in a room, or doing affirming activities that are queered in themselves, like going to queer co-parenting events is a way that I've been like, oh, okay, this is a side of me that I didn't realize other people were exploring, and that makes me feel more well because I feel like I'm not alone. And yeah, so I guess it was, so when I was writing that article, I was interviewing some people of like, how is healthcare not working for you? And I definitely found that trans communities were the people that were struggling the most, like especially trans female people, where they were saying they experienced this sudden shift of when they were seen and perceived as a different gender. When moving towards a more feminine side, that's when doctors started not believing their symptoms as much, in a way that like cis women might have normalized, but also then having access to healthcare was much more restrictive than other communities. So I guess I was wondering if there's any other things like that came up from like intersex communities, for example, of how healthcare just doesn't know enough about their experience.
Yeah, I think that was definitely like a thread in individual conversations. But I also think because, Queer Circle is more of a community setting than a healthcare setting, a big issue that resonated with me is around like burnout and care labor. And I think that's a big one, especially for people doing this in community settings where, not that it's great for people in the healthcare setting, but that it's almost less equipped in the community setting to support the people who are doing this work. And actually at the last event, Francis, you could remind me of the name of the artist who talked about like, creating a toolkit.
Daniel Reagan.
Yeah, and it's like almost like put your oxygen mask on before you help others sort of vibe. And I think that, that is just like a big issue all around, whether that's in like creative health or other kind of LGBTQ settings, or other kinds of support as well.
Yeah,
I think it's really important to expand that definition of healthcare. I think maybe LGBTQ communities, like the only reason we are allowed to be communities is because we found one another in the first place, and sometimes you just need somewhere to go to do that. Like that's such a big moment when you walk into the room, or you go to the bar for the first time, you cross that threshold, and suddenly you're like meant to be in this community. And often that is a commercial scene environment when you're young, but I guess there's been a kind of since the pandemic, and 60% of LGBTQ venues have closed in London over the last 10 years. And there's kind of a new crop of new venues, like the LGBTQ Centre in Southwark, the centre there, and ourselves, and Queer Britain, and other places that provide sober, daytime social queer spaces that are more less scene orientated. They just allow people to meet with shared interests, and that's more important, you could argue, for LGBTQ people, because that's the only way you can become connected to a broader relational set of people, is through knowing other people other than your partner. It's not just about your partner, it's about the broader context that supports you to become who you are. So that's one point. And then just come back to the NHS as the usual suspect. I'll just be a little careful of identifying the NHS as a sort of usual suspect in a problematic way, because undoubtedly innovation comes slow to the NHS. We know this. However, in terms of, in social and health inequalities, it has played a really central role in maintaining that across the country over many years. And without it, you would have to rely, as Yasmin says, more and more on our venues that aren't equipped and aren't funded long term and that struggle. And so there's always a sort of play off between, statutory services, like even with something like the AIDS epidemic, a lot of the voluntary services became statutory over time, and there's still residues of that with the people that I work with. But it's always a compromise to work in between community and institutions, and that's where we find ourselves really as Queer Circle, trying to navigate that space, which isn't always an easy one to occupy. But just be cautious of, I know in the Creative Health report, it was the only critical mention of anything was actually in relation to the NHS, saying it was bureaucratic and cumbersome. And I think I made a point in my book to say, well, did okay in the pandemic on that front, relative to private healthcare providers who are increasingly stepping in. So just to make sure that it's not too much of an enemy of the NHS.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of the kind of events that I've been part of in terms of creative health this past year, there's often people in the audience saying the NHS just don't care about this. And I'm like, I'm meeting with the NHS. They do. There's so many people that are enthusiastic, and they're under all the pressures of how to make this work within a system where there's limited resources and things like that. So I definitely don't want to suggest they're the enemy in this scenario.
Well, I suppose it's just that either orness, really. It's like a binary way of thinking, and then
Oh, sorry, is it okay if I pick up on like one of Francis's earlier points?
Yeah, of course.
Because it just reminded me of like what we talked about in the report. So Jane, you were also talking about like particularly trans people's experiences in the healthcare system, and one of the things that we have found in speaking to people, and which we discussed in the report, is like, once again, the value of having that space, and in the sense that when you're around in a queer space, then that's something that you don't have to think about in the same way that as when you go into like a healthcare system, when it's like almost like by being there, you're made like hyper aware, and that is one of the ways to like have a more like embodied sense of like a being. And that's one of the, so if we weren't thinking about like healthcare in that like traditional biomedical sense, and we thought about it in like a more expansive way, then that's like a really important site where that sense of well-being can take place in these queer spaces.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of people who come here feel quite released on entering, where you don't have to worry about it, your identity, because you can park it at the door because it's already designated in the space. So in a sense, you're released to be something else when you're in it, and you can just be whatever else you are apart from this label, in a way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I really loved about your presentation was talking about the influx aspect of health and well-being, because I think that resonates with me, that like being a human is so complicated, and like one part of you can be really well whilst another part is struggling, and how we communicate about that when thinking of it in a linear format can be jarring, when you're like, no, I am well, but like there's also this stuff like going on. I guess how did those conversations come up when you were talking about them?
I mean, I think like that point of it being in flux, I mean, like I said in my presentation, like this is not prescriptive, and it's obviously not just true for queer people, because recently I was working on like another research project that's with like a lot of community projects that were funded by a funder, particularly to address health inequalities in deprived areas. And one of the things is that this is like quite a long-term project. It took place over like many years, and the people that are a part of these projects are often quite elderly. So what does it mean that, you know, from year 1 to year 10, like a lot of self-reported health ratings are worse, but they've had that time to engage with those activities, and it doesn't look great at the end to say people feel worse, but it's because, you know, they've aged and that just happens. And so we can't always use that as a way, like a before and after, to get a sense of what's actually important for people. And I think that coming up in conversation was actually quite organic. I think in a way, like I wasn't expecting that, but it was really obvious to a lot of people, particularly people who are facilitating these workshops, because they get that energy and like they're always responding to it. And I think it's quite clear to them that that's just not how it works. And so they've been able to kind of say that to me.
Yeah, in a recent event, so we had Ted Brown, who was an original GLF activist whose partner had dementia and went into a care home and was really badly treated there, a homophobic abuse in a care home. And it was a really harrowing event, actually, to listen to these stories. It was interesting, you know, we tried to sort of end on a call to action. So there was quite a fine line between affirmation of human value in the face of really very, very, very dehumanizing institutions and really acknowledging the pain of that. You know, like I was quite aware of ending on a better note, like, then this is terrible, we've got nothing to look forward to, and there's no way of stopping. You know what I mean? Like it was quite, like the line. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about how we could resist that, but I think just the sheer act of treating each other and Ted in the room with respect in that moment and really listening was kind of the core of the event, which managed to make it bearable and hopeful rather than, you know, too difficult to look at.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think kind of bringing up on what both of you talked about there, if I talk about like my own experience, I've accessed like formal counselling services where at the end they were like, oh, you're making me look bad, you've scored the worst so far. And I was like, you can't tell me off for having feelings that are like honest on this day. Like my overall progress might be benefiting, but on this day when you've asked me, I'm having a bad day, it doesn't matter. And in comparison, I went to a queer retreat with We Create Space, where we looked at just your experiences, both as a queer person, but as an intersectional person, and just holding space for one another and allowing each other to be the full version of yourself was far more healing, far more like liberating as an experience, not being measured of whether I was hitting their targets for them, and just moving at my own pace. So I'm definitely feeling resonance with what you both are saying. I guess so. You talked a bit about living histories, and I really loved the example you talked about in terms of the quilt, and as a kind of example from history. Is there any kind of projects that you think are that living history from today that you're really excited by?
Wow, it's funny you should say that. So that Teresa Margolis is an artist who's worked on the Mexican border about disappeared people and is currently casting these faces downstairs. And I get to meet a lot of the people who go in to have their face cast, and then it'll be made into this sculpture on the fourth plinth that I think is likely to be quite contentious. Already GB News have got some distorted version of what that's meant to represent out online yesterday, and there's just something about the collection of knowledge. So Teresa will have talked to everybody that's involved, and it's to see people go in and out and have that experience and then talk to them. I've been around the edges of that project. It's a profoundly kind of restorative, humanizing endeavor that, you know, is almost sitting behind the artwork on the fourth plinth that people won't see. Like, I imagine that it might filter through back into an art space at some point with people's permissions, and we don't know quite how that will play out. But for me, that sort of restoring of people's humanities through listening, paying attention, paying respect, and honouring them has been a bit like that. And I suppose there are similar themes of loss and representation of loss potentially there. It's based on Aztec temples, with skulls. So it's quite a dark piece, but a very powerful piece. But for me, I've almost seen the other side of it, of aliveness and people feeling happy to be in the space and be part of it. So, that's been very inspirational to me, actually.
Yeah. I want to shout out another project that's taking place in Mexico, or like a residency from the Museum of Transology, which is led by the curator E.J. Scott. And obviously, like, heritage is a part of creative health as well. And so it's a really cool space. And I haven't been in a while, but people come together to archive objects from the trans community, or they can bring their own objects. And I think, obviously, on one hand, it's important to have, this history that hasn't been archived or preserved well, but on the other hand, that space in itself is like similar to what I was speaking about before. It's a really important way of getting people together to make the most of that and to spend that time together. And yeah, I just think like a lot of the objects are, some of it's irreverent and some of it's very serious, but it's just like an amazing collection anyway. And I think over the next year as well, they will be going across the country for like a collective trans day of collecting. So yeah, check that out if people are interested.
Amazing.
So those two projects sit side by side at Queer Circle at the moment. So people drift in and out of both of those. So yeah.
Oh, awesome.
And check out the website, Museum of Transology. You can Google it and take a look there too if you're interested.
I'm aware that we're kind of drawing towards the end of our time. So I guess if I create a final question for the day, if people are watching this and they're kind of new to it and they're going, okay, I'm excited, where do I go to find out more? Or how do they get involved? Do you have any kind of hints and tips of where to start?
Well, we have check out our Instagram account. All our events are posted on there, Queer Circle, and you're welcome to browse the reports on the website. Yasmin, do you have any further?
I mean, I'm sure people are already doing this anyway, but I would just also really encourage people to support their local LGBT projects, and whether that's just by showing up or, volunteering and things like that, because I think there's just so many cool things going on, and that's one of the great things about Queer Circle as well, is to see how all of these things come together.
I'm really grateful for Montfort University for putting this together, actually, and having these conversations within universities. I think that's really, really important. So thank you for inviting us today. It's a bit tantalising not seeing you all out there. I don't know how many of you there are or what your faces are, but I know you're out there.
Fabulous. And then I think we have some links that Faye is going to put up as well, which will be some of the resources that are available that I'll be able to share as well after the event. So if anyone would like to find out more about those, do have a click through. Thank you all for joining us today. If you're interested in going to any other DMU Pride events, do check out their website and see what else is going on. There's going to be a great range of stuff going on over February. And yeah, thank you for joining us, both of you. It's been really great having you here.
Thank you.